Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. I bet a lot of people will recognize that. It's a famous opening from Rousseau's Social Contract from 1762, Du Contrat Social, I believe is the French title, although my French speakers can correct me. I love doing this show because you can start an episode out saying, I'm going to talk today about rights. And then for an hour, you can talk for an hour and be like, okay, now we're almost ready to talk about rights. And I genuinely mean, I do love that aspect of it. I love that you guys are with me for talking about the deep weeds on this stuff, because really the point of a classical education is to go back to the roots, right? Think about where stuff came from. That's the story that we've been telling when it comes to the right to life, the right to liberty, the right to the pursuit of happiness. And I've been fixating on this sentence from the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. And what I've basically been arguing, you could sum up the whole series as an argument that every part of that sentence is essential, that you can't take one away and keep all the nice rights that we have, even though we think we can, and that in order to understand them, you have to know the history of thought behind them. So I've been talking, for example, about what it means for something to really be self-evident, right? It's a self-evident truth that men are created equal, but that doesn't mean that people are just born into the world knowing it, as we see in places like Sparta, right? Or indeed even in Plato's Republic, the idea that you would just throw babies off cliffs if they don't benefit you or whatever, abandon them outside, right? We've gotten up now to the medieval Catholic philosopher, St. Thomas Aquinas, and the idea of natural law. And as I said, I'm not sure how long this series is going to go. We're going to be talking now about the Enlightenment and the time when America was itself actually founded. And we're on our way, remember, to understanding not just the abortion debate, which as I speak is raging and will continue to rage, because it looks like, as of right now, it looks like they're going to overturn Roe v. Wade. It's still a draft decision. By the time you hear this, maybe it will have been confirmed or there'll be something else. But either way, we're going to be talking about this a lot in our politics. And then I also mentioned the Canadian euthanasia, assisted suicide debate, this thing where people are having to off themselves with government help because the government doesn't want to pay for them, basically, to have health care. And so, the cruelty, the abject cruelty of that and of late-term abortions, right, that we see now. I mean, I believe that all abortion is killing a child. But even if you're undecided on the question, I think a lot of moderates, so-called, are looking at this and saying, well, obviously something has gone wrong if we've moved from safe, legal, and rare to dismembering children in the womb, right? And so I asked the question, how is it that in the so-called name of rights, right, the right of the woman to have bodily autonomy, the right of people to, end their lives if they're terminally ill, right? How do these cash out in terms of obvious atrocities and often in terms of denying people rights, such as babies, right? And so I've been talking about one reason why, which is that we have this conviction that certain things are, let's say, simply innate in us. Essentially, we have worth, right? They have essentially equal. And yet we think that conviction came to us just because we're such good, nice people and we're so much better than the savages in the past, right? But what I've actually been arguing is that we have these convictions because we were shaped and raised by a society that came from somewhere and that had, in turn, passed those convictions on in our founding documents and in our cultural practices, so that we now react with horror, right, instinctively with horror, to abridgments of the right to life, right, to people being killed, for instance, because they're simply too weak or too unproductive, right? And that reaction, I've been arguing, is not natural to you in the sense that everybody would just always have it, but has to be trained and habituated until, like all morality, it becomes what Aristotle would have called like a second nature, right? These self-evident truths don't just come to us in our hearts, right? We can intuit some of them, right, using our reason, but also we need revelation and we need training, right? We need long cultural training and cultural norms, to use a much maligned word, right, to shape us into the kinds of people who see that all men are created equal. So what about this idea of rights? That's what I'm going to get into now, and I'm going to get into it because it's so central to the Declaration and also a major point of contention within the Enlightenment and after. If you are hiring, I cannot recommend Indeed highly enough. I know a lot of people are hiring, and I think I have a probably disproportionate representation of small business owners among my listeners, which is great. Love to have you. God bless you. It's really time consuming and difficult to find good hires, and Indeed is the place to go to solve that problem. They're the only job site where you're guaranteed to find quality applications that meet your must-have requirements, or else you don't pay. If you're hiring, you need them because they are the hiring partner where you can attract, interview, and hire all in one place. And with Instant Match, as soon as you sponsor a post, you get a short list of quality candidates with resumes on Indeed that match your job description. We can personally attest over here at Soundfront that we use this all the time. And it's great for finding top quality talent, whatever the field, whatever the dimension, whatever you need. It's just really a great site, all inclusive, does everything you need. You can start hiring right now with a $75 sponsored job credit if you use the unique Young Heretics link at Indeed.com/heretics. That's Indeed.com/heretics to get your $75 credit. Indeed.com/heretics. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. A lot of times you will hear people, often on the left, sometimes on the right, say that, well, natural law comes out of this obviously Catholic tradition, and before that out of this Judeo-Christian wisdom teaching and scripture, right? But natural rights, and indeed rights in general, or some people even go further and distinguish positive rights, positive law, which doesn't come down to you from God at all, but which is granted you by the state, right? That's a secular thing. And so we can have our rights, right? We can have our rights and be secular. We don't need to think that they come from God. The state gives them to us, and we can work it out through common sense. How do we get to that conclusion when it's obvious that to believe all men are created equal, you have to come from this religious tradition? Well, during the Enlightenment, which remember is the period sort of after the 30 Years' War, post Reformation, when there's been a kind of religious non-aggression pact between the countries of Europe, and it seems like science is really taking off, and it's going to be the age of reason, right? And you get people arguing that, well, we really can leave behind a lot of the incrustations of superstition and supernatural explanations for things. We're going to have science, we're going to have logic, and it's going to be great. And I've already talked to you about the excesses of that idea for a while now. And I want to now talk about how that age, that spirit, leads us not necessarily actually into total secularism, but into a language of talking about rights that looks like it can be detached and separated away from this older tradition of natural law and divine law, right? And that's why I started with Rousseau's Social Contract, because Rousseau, along with Hobbes and Locke, major Enlightenment era philosopher. I said this is happening right around the same time as the American Revolution is occurring. There's a lot of Enlightenment stuff in the air in America, a lot of Enlightenment justifications, style justifications for the American Revolution, but also this strong foundational Puritan tradition of the Puritans who helped found the country, right? And a deep religious conviction, which is why the creator is still in the Declaration. But here is Rousseau, and I want to talk a little bit about him en route to this idea of rights. So not only do you have, are you endowed by your creator with his image, and therefore you're inherently, the natural law prohibits people from just killing you, for instance. But you, therefore, it is thought, right, have a right to life, meaning you are either worthy of life or you are guaranteed life, and nobody's allowed to take that away. So that's what a right is, right? Something you you can have. You are it belongs to you, and nobody gets to take it away from you, and it's unjust if they do. And this is one interesting reason why, when we start talking about human rights, we often also start talking about human dignity, because dignity in Latin, right, comes from dignus, which means worthy, right? It's the idea that you are worthy of something. And this already you can start to hear what I consider a real corruption of talking come in, a real corruption of the language, because if dignity is this idea that you are somehow worthy of a thing, and what I've been suggesting is that you're not actually worthy of your rights, or rather your rights don't depend on your worthiness of them. If they do, then you're going to go astray. You're not worthy of your rights. You are granted them by God. He invests in you the nature of a human being, and then we might argue, right, you have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, so let me just read to you the opening passage of the Social Contract, and then we will go a little bit more into the text as well. Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. One thinks himself the master of others, and still remains a greater slave than they. How did this change come about? I do not know. What can make it legitimate? That question I think I can answer. If I took into account only force and the effects derived from it, I should say, as long as a people is compelled to obey and obeys, it does well. As soon as it can shake off the yoke and shakes it off, it does still better. For regaining its liberty by the same right as took it away, either it is justified in resuming it, or there was no justification for those who took it away. But the social order is a sacred right, which is the basis of all other rights. Nevertheless, this right does not come from nature and must therefore be founded on conventions. Before coming to that, I have to prove what I have just asserted. And he does this by talking about how societies form, right? He has this kind of this theory of the state of nature and how they come into being. And that people always say man is born free, is everywhere and changed, and therefore this is this great injustice in the world. But one of the points of the social contract is how there can be a just form of binding oneself, right? How communities with consent, right, can come into being and come together. It is the social order is a sacred right, which is the basis of all other rights. This is another misconception people have about Rousseau, that he was some kind of he was among the philosophes and the atheists of the French Enlightenment. But actually, he had a correspondence with Voltaire, who really did hate Christianity. Écraser l'infâme, he said. You could just wipe out the cursed thing. And that spirit is, of course, manifest in the French Revolution, but it hasn't happened yet when Rousseau is writing. And Rousseau had an exchange with Voltaire in which he indicated his belief in God. And I also want to read to you, notice he talks about the sacred right? The right of the social order from which all other rights are derived. I'm not going to get into his argument for that today. We may come back to it later, but I want to talk to you about the sort of religious underpinning, the weird religious underpinning of this argument. Because near the end, he starts talking about what is called civil religion. He talks about the true religion, which is Christianity, and then he talks about different kinds of religion that mankind may have, but setting aside political considerations. Let us come back to what is right, he says, and settle our principles on this important point. The right which the social compact gives the sovereign over the subjects does not, as we have seen, exceed the limits of public expediency. So you can start to see people are talking in the way that I was talking when I argued about Burke, that we're able to take back the special privileges that Disney has, right, in Florida. I was arguing that we can take those back because they come from us, because we're the people, we give our consent, we are the governed. And all just governments derive their authority from the consent of the governed. And so this idea that rights, right, which are founded, again, distantly on the idea of sort of human equality, right, that mankind is created equal, now become this sort of thing that we carry in and of ourselves. We are rights bearers, right? It does not exceed the limit of public expediency. The subject then owe the sovereign an account of their opinions only to such an extent as they matter to the community. So he's saying, what interest does the state have in people's religion? He's saying there are all sorts of private areas where you can believe whatever you want to believe, right? You can believe that there are angels or you believe there's no angels. It doesn't really matter for the state. There may be a truth about it. It's not your job, it's not the state's job, rather, to intrude and figure it out. You see sort of the idea of religious liberty kind of coming into being here too, right? Now, it matters very much to the community that each citizen should have a religion. So he's saying we can't, though, just let people be atheists. That will make him love his duty. The religion will make his love his duty, but the dogmas of that religion concern the state and its members only so far as they have reference to morality and to the duties which he who professes them is bound to do to others. Each man may have, over and above what opinions he pleases, without its being the sovereign's business to take cognizance of them. For as the sovereign has no authority in the other world, whatever the loss of its subjects may be in the life to come, that is not its business, provided they are good citizens in this life. I have a joke with my friend Michael Knowles. I'm sure a lot of you guys listen to his podcast too over at the Daily Wire. And Knowles is a Catholic and I'm not, but we agree about a lot of stuff nevertheless. And we always joke about based John Locke and based Rousseau, because the idea is that people think of these philosophers as sort of the creators of our present discontents, because they argued against religion and God and the state. And I think there's a lot to that. You can start to see, and I'm going to continue arguing how this stuff starts to go awry as it becomes more and more detached from its religious roots. And yet you can see that somebody like Rousseau is an honest and thorough enough thinker that he does recognize the necessity of a religious root to justify and underpin these notions, right, of the law, right, that we are bound to one another, and that it's right for us to be bound to one another when we consent to be, and that the sovereign therefore has a right to rule, right, and he says, therefore, like, you can't allow atheism in your state, right? The sovereign has a business in taking cognizance of such of the opinions as refer to the state. And this is a purely civil profession of faith, which the sovereign should fix the articles of, not exactly as religious dogmas, but as social sentiments, without which a man cannot be a good citizen or a faithful subject. While it can compel no one to believe them, it can banish from the state whoever does not believe them. It can banish him not for impiety, but as an antisocial being, incapable of truly loving the laws and justice, and of sacrificing at need his life to his duty. If anyone, after publicly recognizing these dogmas, behaves as if he does not believe them, let him be punished by death. He has committed the worst of all crimes, that of lying before the law. He's saying, you can, in your heart of hearts, you can think there's no God. In your heart of hearts, you can believe and even say all sorts of things about angels and demons and whatever, but you cannot say or act as if there is no God. Why? Because rights are sacred, right? So you still see that there is in Rousseau an acknowledgement of the religious history here. Not so as things progress. And you can see why, because again, the roots are becoming more distant in vision. They're not becoming less important. And that's another mistake. We think something's not right in front of us, therefore it's not important. It's way back in the past, right? But they are becoming more distant. And people are starting to think, well, with science, we can do so many things without any reference to God. And in fact, also, religion has been a cause of all this war, right? The 30 Years' War and Protestantism and versus Catholicism has lost all these lives and destroyed the political stability of Europe. And now we're going to say there is no sovereign authority, human authority over divine truth. We're going to exclude those questions insofar as possible from the conversations we have in order to live well together. And the sovereign is only interested in the kind of religion that's going to keep the peace. And so whatever Rousseau's personal convictions were, right, he nevertheless thought that the state had an interest, right, in maintaining that one truth, that theism, right, the belief in a divine order and a divine law, because distantly, that's where you get to this whole idea of rights to begin with. However, it is also true, of course, that there is, although there is such a thing as, I believe, divine law and divine right, there is also, nevertheless, right, there has to be a state that, because the world is fallen and because we don't just live in this perfect state of nature, and as Hobbes observed, the state of nature is nasty, poor, life is nasty, poor, brutish, and short, right? There has to be a state that defends those rights, and that's what the founders were arguing. And for that reason, you start to get this idea of positive law and positive rights, which are given to you by the state, right? And so this question emerges, well, does the state give you the rights, or does it just defend the rights that you have from God? And my own position, I've already been arguing, is that you do have some rights from God that come to you from the facts that you were created in God's image. You are endowed with reason. You're a rational animal, and therefore no member of the human species may be deprived of the rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. That's the American argument. But you have to understand that the American argument sits in a certain position on this sliding spectrum, right? And there's other versions of the argument. In Australia, for instance, right, states make laws, right? And that idea is also very prevalent and live. And there can be the case, right, that sometimes one thing is true and sometimes another, right? So life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, free speech, those belong to you from God, I believe. But other rights, like, the rights and duties and privileges of a corporation, of a company, those can come from the government and be taken away by the government, right? So once you start getting into the actual prudential calculations of how you're going to do things in the human world, you start to, as always, right, you can't always be looking at this kind of pure abstraction of divinity. And so you start to forget, like, how do we even get here in the first place? And you're having a conversation and you're like, how do we get here? Right? Why are we talking about? Why are we suddenly talking about Ron DeSantis? Right? I don't know about you, but I often have those moments because you've every step of the way is logical. Every step on the path makes sense to go to the next thing. We were talking about our jobs, and then we were talking about how somebody said something about DeSantis, and now we're talking about Disney, right? And yet by the time you get to Snow White and the Seven Dwarves, you can't remember that you were talking about your work, your legal work for Ron DeSantis or something. Yeah, that's kind of what's going on here. Is that the Western tradition is progressing down this path that comes all the way from the Bible and Paul and the Stoics and all those arguments we talked about last week, right? And develops through Aquinas, right? And has this natural, obvious, organic growth. But now we're at a point where we're starting to make these little arguments over, the state protects the rights, right? Well, the rights then come from the state, and it gets easier and easier to think that, in fact, the rights just are obvious, right? Just reason, right? The same reason that we use to do science, that's the reason that we can use to have rights. And of course, this is the attitude, the basic attitude that Edmund Burke excoriated in the French Revolution. So we've talked about Burke before, his thoughts, reflections on the revolution in France. Obviously, after the American Revolution, so now we've had this American Declaration, which Burke was in favor of, that all men are endowed by their Creator with life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, the rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And yet he's furious about the French Revolution because they're basically kicking out the stool. They want the rights, but they don't want the roots. And so this is a big part of his critique. We're going to return to Burke in a second. But first, I want to read to you the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which is a major French document from the Revolution shortly after the storming of the Bastille. So my cat had a traumatic experience the other day, which is that he got locked out overnight, and he had just snuck out secretly right before we went to bed. And he's not an outdoor cat, and so poor Chad Cat was freaking out. And when we brought him back in order to calm him and to say sorry for locking you outside, we gave him Public Goods freeze-dried duck nibs because they are Chad Cat endorsed best cat snack ever. But that is not the only thing that Public Goods does. This is one of my favorite things. Another one of my favorite things is that they're chocolate-covered almonds, but they make a ton of other snacks, and they make just basics: toilet paper, shampoo, pet food, coffee, really anything that you can imagine. And it's not sort of threaded through with all the weird soy gunk and crap and like stuff that you might find in the grocery store with names that you can't even pronounce. Like, one of the things I love about them is I know anything I get from Public Goods is going to be cleanly made and well made. I really do love everything, and the way that it looks in the kitchen or in the bathroom or wherever you end up putting like their soaps and stuff look great. Really a top quality place, and they are offering $15 off. That's $15 off your first Public Goods order with no minimum purchase. I cannot stress to you highly enough that this is free stuff. You get it for free. There's no minimum purchase, $15 when you go to publicgoods.com/heretics or use the code heretics at checkout. That's PUBLICGOODS.com/heretics. It's like I'm handing you $15 in cash to go spend on this awesome site. Go to publicgoods.com/heretics. So in 1789, I believe it was about a month after they stormed the Bastille, so one of the major events of the French Revolution, the National Assembly of France wrote the following Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. The representatives of the French people, organized as a national assembly, believing that the ignorance, neglect, or contempt of the rights of man are the sole cause of public calamities and of the corruption of governments, have determined to set forth in a solemn declaration the natural, unalienable, and sacred rights of man, in order that this declaration, being constantly before all the members of the social body, shall remind them continually of their rights and duties, in order that the acts of the legislative power, as well as those of the executive power, may be compared at any moment with the objects and purposes of all political institutions, and may thus be more respected. And lastly, in order that the grievances of the citizens, based hereafter upon simple and incontestable principles, shall tend to the maintenance of the Constitution and redound to the happiness of all. Therefore, the National Assembly recognizes and proclaims in the presence and under the auspices of the Supreme Being the following rights of man and the citizen. I want to give this document its due, but I also want to point out some very important differences between it and the Declaration of Independence, because you can hear the consonants, obviously, right? It comes from some of the same Enlightenment ideas. There's a similarity of spirit here, and that idea that they are unalienable, right? That we hear some echoes there, and that the government needs to be held accountable to people's rights, to the rights of man and of the citizen. All kind of along similar lines to the idea that all men are endowed by their creator. And even you get the sacred rights of man, as you do in Rousseau, and you get in the presence and under the auspices of the Supreme Being. So This is not, sometimes I may go overboard in my furor about the French Revolution, just like Burke is very passionate about it. I sort of follow meekly in his footsteps, and I get kind of angry about this stuff. So I might go overboard. I might say, like, this is these atheists tearing down churches. And they really did do some awful stuff. They confiscated church property. They killed people en masse. So I don't want to downplay that either. It truly was a horror. But you note that they haven't yet jettisoned this language of the supreme being. But what they don't do is speak in clear terms about where these rights come from. We're in the presence of the supreme being. These rights are sacred. But do they come from the state or do they come from God? And the reason this is so important is because we are on our way to thinking about how it can be that the state can end up weighing the value of a human life, be it a terminal life, of a dying person, or a person who wants to die, or the life of an infant in the womb, right? How is it that the state can accrue to itself the power? The state can start out by saying that, all men are created equal, and then decide who lives or dies based on its estimation of their worth? Well, this is the fundamental problem with jettisoning natural right and natural law, and therefore the religious tradition altogether, is that if it's all positive law all the way down, that is, if the state gives you your rights, then of course the state can take them away. And if the state says you are equal to your fellow man, and if the state says that you have rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, well, then maybe the state can decide it has an interest in granting those rights to puppies and to robots, but not to 2-year-olds. And if you think I'm joking, we're going to get into some of this stuff later on, that in fact, people like Peter Singer are arguing that infants should and can be killed under quite a lot of circumstances, whereas dogs probably, more intelligent. So if you give this power to the state to decide, you will ultimately not be free. You will not be born free. You will not be any kind of absolutely free. You will be under the tyranny of a sovereign that gets to decide your rights. The only safe place to locate your rights intellectually is in God. They come from God. If they come anywhere at all, those inalienable rights must come from God. And one of the fatal flaws of this Declaration of the Rights of Man is it does not specify. It says they're sacred, right? But are we worshiping them, or are we worshiping the giver? And is the giver God? We're not told. It doesn't say, right? Under the auspices of the supreme being. Note how different that is from the Declaration of Independence. All men are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Both of them, by the way, justifying what Rousseau talks about, which is reclaiming one's original liberty and starting a new state. But this is also a major point of contention for Burke, right? That you don't actually have that right willy-nilly. Let's read some of Burke's comments about rights in response to this so that we can start to understand that this is neither the American position now, nor my position, nor the French position, but the Burkean position, which is subtly different. And this is where we start to understand the landscape of where this stuff is so that we can know where we stand, right, in that landscape. It's so crucial to understand that this was not just like some one-off American thing, but it was a path that was charted among a number of available paths for the forward-looking future of the Western tradition. And I believe it was the right path. I think this is a major reason why I always say America is the inheritor of the best of the West, right? America is the leader of this long history, and as America goes, so goes the West, because we are the most advanced development in this history. But here's Burke, right? So remember I talked about Burke's bill with Fox about the East India Company and how he was defending the natural law, which gives people the ability to be to claim that they shouldn't just be killed or mistreated, even though they're brown and poor and far away, right? And that was his great sort of liberal attitude, because he believes that the natural law is the same everywhere. Here he is in defense of that bill. He says, the rights of men, that is to say, the natural rights of mankind, are indeed sacred things, and if any public measure is proven mischievously to affect them, the objection ought to be fatal to that measure. Sounds actually like the French and the Americans a lot at that point, right? Even if no charter at all could be set up against it. If these natural rights are further affirmed and declared by express covenants, if they are clearly defined and secured against chicane, against power and authority by written instruments and positive engagements, they are in a still better condition. Note that word positive engagement, right? This is positive law defending natural rights, right? As opposed to positive rights, right? Which are given and taken away. And this is a good, clear, we need to have these documents because they defend our natural rights, right? They partake not only of the sanctity of the object so secured, but of that solemn public faith itself, which secures an object of such importance. The things secured by these instruments may, without any deceitful ambiguity, be very fitly called the chartered rights of men. So here he's basically agreeing with me, right? And I'm in turn agreeing, well, he's not agreeing with me, I'm agreeing with him, and we're both sort of agreeing with the Declaration as over and against this sort of ambiguity inherent in the Enlightenment, French Enlightenment tradition, right? Now here's reflections on the revolution in France. These metaphysic rights entering into common life like rays of light, which pierce into a dense medium, are, by the laws of nature, refracted from their straight line. Indeed, in the gross and complicated mass of human passions and concerns, the primitive rights of men undergo such a variety of refractions and reflections that it becomes absurd to talk of them as if they continued in the simplicity of their original direction. The nature of man is intricate. The objects of society are of the greatest possible complexity, and therefore no simple disposition or direction of power can be suitable to man's nature or to the quality of his affairs. When I hear the simplicity of contrivance aimed at and boasted of in any new political constitutions, I am at no loss to decide that the artificers are grossly ignorant of their trade or totally negligent of their duty. Now he's getting a little more Burkean and a little less American, right? Because he's saying, well, look, if you think that you can just pluck the eternal law down fully and plonk it onto a piece of paper, you're crazy, right? If you think that you can just take these pure abstract axioms that exist in God's mind and you can charter them in this document for all time, you're nuts. And both the American tradition and the French tradition, it has to be said, do have this idea. I've argued, though, that there's an important difference, right? Which is that we follow on from the English common law tradition. We believe what Burke is saying. We just also think that there are certain rights that need, as he was arguing in the Fox Bill, to be laid out, right? These things come from God. They are not to be abridged, right? And now we are going to go forth in the business, and this is where Aquinas really comes into view, right? Interestingly, sort of behind Burke, is that it's like light refracting through a window, right? Yes, there's pure absolute truth out there, but mankind is a mess, life is a mess, and every age is going to bring up new challenges, new difficulties. And if you think that you can just lay out this big long list of things, right, that's so pure and simple because it's just based on reason, right, then you haven't understood at all what human beings are, what the business of practical reason and prudence is, and what governments are there to do, even in the Enlightenment age. So Burke is really good on this stuff, even though he challenges Americans, and we're going to get in a bit into even more challenging stuff to Americans. But this is the spirit of the age that is part of the American Revolution. But note that America looks forward and backward, whereas France only looks forward, right, and cuts out the roots. And it gets worse, right? It's going to get worse as we go on, right? These later declarations of rights, which are totally kind of agnostic or don't involve God. The crucial hook in the Declaration that sets it apart from the disastrous French Revolution is its affirmation that we are endowed by our Creator. And what I have been arguing, again, is that too cannot be taken away, that there were a number of ways forward during this time. America picked one, and you have to know that that's the country you're living in. If you want to alter that, you are fundamentally altering what the founders decided to do in the context of the options that were available to them at the time. And so just because we have progressed so far down this sort of line and conversation that we can now talk about these things without immediate reference to God, right? We are inclined to forget that God is the source of it all, both in the tradition and in actual fact. And that is how you get this sort of value-neutral, supposedly secularist language of human rights. So here, from 1948, is the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the General Assembly. This is a document that's often cited by people who talk about these sorts of things, and rightly so, because listen to this, right? The General Assembly proclaims this universal declaration of human rights as a common standard of achievement for all peoples and all nations, to the end that every individual and every organ of society, keeping this declaration constantly in mind, shall strive by teaching and education to promote respect for these rights and freedoms, and by progressive measures, national and international, to secure their universal and effective recognition and observance, both among the peoples of member states themselves and among the peoples of territories under their jurisdiction. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Okay, now we're noticing this progression, right, from the Declaration of Independence to the Declaration of the Rights of Man to this UN Declaration of Human Rights, which is this idea. I mean, human rights, right, are an attempt to do what Burke is talking about, to pluck these kind of universal, eternal truths that apply for everyone, everywhere, in all times and places. But note what they do. Born free and equal in dignity and rights. It's very Rousseauian, but it adds this dignity idea that you're not just given something, you are dignus, you are worthy of it. You are somehow, and therefore, of course, your rights are a sign of your dignity. And this is why, right, it's not just bad to take somebody's rights away, but it's an affront, right? It's an affront to me if you won't let gay people get married. It's an affront, right? This is where we start to get offended and emotional all the time, right? It's because dignity has this inherent concept that it's a slap in the face when somebody disagrees about what you have a right to, right? They are endowed with reason and conscience. Endowed by whom? We're not told, right? And should act toward one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Well, as I said last week, brothers have one father, right? Who's that? Who's the father? So all of this language, right, is shot through with religious reasoning, but refuses to acknowledge that religious reasoning. And in fact, one of the rights, right, is the right to choose your own religion, which again, I defend that right up to a point, right? I do think that you should be free to believe what you believe. I don't think you should therefore be free to call anything a religion, right, and get protections for like the Church of Satan or the Flying Spaghetti Monster. But yes, I think you should have freedom of religion. But note that all of this language, every word of this language, rights, endowed, brotherhood, right? Every word in this text comes freighted with theological history and doesn't make any sense without the theological history. It makes no sense to talk about the brotherhood of man unless man has a common father. It makes no sense to talk about endowed with reason and conscience unless somebody's doing the endowing. It makes no sense to talk about being born free unless somebody declares that you are free, because as we have seen, of course, there is no certainty among the common mass of humanity that all men are born free. And the only person who has the authority to declare you free in a way that nobody can ever revoke is God. If you give that authority to government, they are going to end up deciding whether you are really dignus or not, whether you are really worthy of the dignity of the rights that you are given. And that, my friends, is how we end up in a purely secular world of rights. That is how we end up with pursuits of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that ultimately end up in dystopian horror, because they have completely forgotten. Not only have they forgotten where the language comes from, but they're using words that in the very structure of their syllables, right, harkens back to the necessity of understanding them in a theological context. And that those very words, though, are now divorced from their theological context by people who deny that context matters and don't understand where it came from or why, right? And that, when you do that, you have literally written yourself a recipe for madness. You have cut the ground underneath yourself, even while you attempt to persist, to keep walking in midair. And as we know from the cartoons, when Wile E. Coyote runs off the cliff, he can stay in midair for a while, but eventually he plummets to the ground. And this is why this is happening, right? Now you understand. And now I hope you will understand that if you feel inclined to say, well, all of this stuff can come without God, right? I defy you to show me how, right? I would happily say to you, like, oh, sure, like, go do whatever you want, right? I'm not trying here to, like, make you feel bad about not being able to believe or whatever. What I'm trying to do is show you that this is the tradition that you've got. And if you want that tradition, you have to at least understand that God is not erasable from it, that he's not an option in this whole history of logic. And once you take God away, you end up speaking complete gibberish and nonsense without even knowing. Nobody who wrote this declaration thought he was saying anything but the most elevated and dignified thing. I thought this was a great gift to humanity. And yet, of course, they're speaking nonsense. Endowed, dignity, brotherhood, rights, all of these words make no sense in the context that they are trying to give it, which is a secularist context. Let us now, as we begin to move further and further into the present day, I will just mention in passing, although we don't have time to get to him in great detail, that Kant is behind a lot of this sort of universalism, that, the metaphysics of morals, the critique of practical reason, also happening around the end of the 18th century. I'll read one quote for you because we don't have time to get into too much of it. Any action is right if it can coexist with everyone's freedom in accordance with the universal law, or if on its maxim, the freedom of choice of each can coexist with everyone's freedom in accordance with a universal law. So this is leading toward the idea of the categorical imperative, and toward the idea that, you need to be able to argue at a universal level for all of your morality and indeed all of your politics. that too is an ingredient in the Enlightenment era idea of rights, as is Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, as is America, as is even the French Revolution, and indeed even Burke. But what I have been arguing to you is that America alone charted a course that linked it forever to the creator endowing the rights. And we are now seeing that unless he endows them, nobody else has power enough to give them in a way that can be guaranteed. If the state gives them to you, the state's going to end up taking them away. Let me now read a dissenting voice by somebody that I really like, in fact, love, a book that changed my life, but a book that denies a lot of what I have just been saying. I have this recurring shoulder thing from bench press that it's just like, it comes back every now and then. It's not the worst, but it just kind of nags at me. I used Theragun on it recently, and it was like a revelation. Like this thing is so good. I've been using it for a long time. Really good for weightlifters, people that work out a lot, but just in general, there's stress involved in daily life, and it weighs on your body. Theragun is the handheld percussive therapy device that releases your deepest muscle tension using a scientifically calibrated combo of depth, speed, and power, and it's as quiet as an electric toothbrush, and it feels great. It's such a relief because, again, you probably don't know all the tension that you're holding in your body. I know I don't. I always feel like I don't really need, like every time I use Theragun, I think like, I probably don't need this thing. And then you do it and it's like, oh, wait, I really did. Like you build stuff up, and everybody does, whether you have a job that involves manual labor, whether you have a job where you just sit and hunch over a computer all day. I mean, I have a little bit of both in the sense that like, I do a lot of physical activity, but I also do, cramp myself over a typewriter and write my like deathless prose or whatever. And that stuff weighs on your body too. So whatever you are doing, you should try Theragun. You can try it for 30 days, starting at only $199 when you go to therabody.com/heretics. That's my special link just for you, therabody.com/heretics, and get your Gen 4 Theragun today. It's therabody.com/heretics to start at only $199 for 30 days. All right, this is a book called After Virtue, and it's by a philosopher who is still living named Alistair MacIntyre. And After Virtue is a book which explains, it's one of those books that just explains like everything. So I highly recommend that you go away and read it. I don't have time to describe his entire argument in detail, but he is basically arguing about the breakdown of classical morality in which, within the context of the polis, right, we understand our mutual net of obligations to one another, we don't understand ourselves as these sort of free-floating individuals, but all of our sort of ethical worth and honor and value is measured in our relationships to each other. Because once that breaks down, you can only have little mini communities in which that's true, and other communities where different first principles obtain, and those communities can't talk to each other. Because every community, in order to form into a real cohesive whole, right, has to agree on certain first principles, like that mankind has a right to the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. But if somebody else in another community doesn't agree, all you can do is shout, because you can't argue for first principles. So that's basically an outline of it, but it's much more complicated than that. I'm going to read to you now from what he has to say about rights, and then we will talk. Contemporary moral experience has a paradoxical character, for each of us is taught to see himself or herself as an autonomous moral agent, but each of us also becomes engaged by modes of practice, aesthetic or bureaucratic, which involve us in manipulative relationships with others. Seeking to protect the autonomy that we have learned to prize, we aspire ourselves not to be manipulated by others, seeking to incarnate our own principles and standpoint in the world of practice. We find no way open to us to do so except by directing towards others those very manipulative modes of relationship which each of us aspires to resist in our own case. The incoherence of our attitudes and our experience arises from the incoherent conceptual scheme which we have inherited. So he's about to argue that a lot of the inheritance that I say exists in America is bunk and is causing this problem because of the autonomy principle, right? Because we think of ourselves as unrelated to one another. And yet, right, we need things from each other. We want things out of each other. And we try to manipulate each other into these positions. Like, for example, when Obergefell was passed, there was a county clerk who refused to certify those marriage certificates. And that's, the left, the passionate, angry left coming for her job, her sort of trying to, make a stand against the state, right? Each of them in this kind of mutually unintelligible role and conflict with one another, kind of a state of nature. Once we have understood this, it is possible to understand also the key place that three other concepts have in the distinctively modern moral scheme, that of rights, that of protest, and that of unmasking. By rights, I do not mean those rights conferred by positive law or custom on specified classes of person. I mean those rights which are alleged to belong to human beings as such, and which are cited as a reason for holding that people ought not to be interfered with in their pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness. They are the rights which were spoken of in the 18th century as natural rights, or as the rights of man. Characteristically, in that century, they were defined negatively, precisely as rights not to be interfered with. But sometimes in that century, and much more often in our own, positive rights, rights to due process, to education, or to employment are examples, are added to the list. The expression human rights is now commoner than either of the 18th century expressions. But whether negative or positive, and however named, they are supposed to attach equally to all individuals, whatever their sex, race, religion, talents, or deserts, and to provide a ground for a variety of particular moral stances. So he's saying basically what I have been saying about a lot of rights tradition, but not all rights tradition, which is that it attributes to all people certain inherent rights, right? Certain things that they are owed, without really affirming the source from whence they come or being specific at all about where they come from. And he's saying positive rights make sense. If the law gives you rights, then the law is saying that you can or can't do something. But this idea of rights is kind of a fantasy. It would, of course, I'm going to go on. It would, of course, be a little odd that there should be such rights attaching to human beings simply qua human beings in light of the fact, which I alluded to in my discussion of Gewerth's argument, that there is no expression in any ancient or medieval language correctly translated by our expression, a right, until near the close of the Middle Ages. The concept lacks any means of expression in Hebrew, Greek, Latin, or Arabic, classical or medieval, before about 1400, let alone in Old English, or in Japanese even as late as the mid-19th century. From this, it does not, of course, follow that there are no natural or human rights. It only follows that no one could have known that there were. And this at least raises certain questions. But we do not need to be distracted into answering them, for the truth is plain. There are no such rights, and belief in them is one with belief in witches and in unicorns. The best reason for asserting so bluntly that there are no such rights is instead of precisely the same type as the best reason which we possess for asserting that there are no witches and the best reason which we possess for asserting that there are no unicorns. Every attempt to give good reasons for believing that there are such rights has failed. The 18th century philosophical defenders of natural rights sometimes suggest that the assertions which state that men possess them are self-evident truths, but we know that there are no self-evident truths. 20th century moral philosophers have sometimes appealed to their and our intuitions, but one of the things that we ought to have learned from the history of moral philosophy is that the introduction of the word intuition by a moral philosopher is always a signal that something has gone badly wrong with an argument. I'm going to stop there because that's like a personal attack. At me next time, Alistair, because I talk about intuitions all the time. I love recovering implicit intuitions because I think they're an antidote to our sort of hyper-rationalist, hyper-scientistic age. But all of that having been said, I get what he's saying. Intuition is this fuzzy way, right, of talking about something that you can't argue for. Now, this is a powerful attack on the idea of rights per se. I think, now I'm engaging here with somebody that I avow to be much smarter than me, right? I love MacIntyre very much. I think he writes fantastically insightful stuff. But I think he can only make this argument because the language of rights is so corrupted in so many instances, except for the American one, right? That when it's true that when you detach rights from their context, they look like something that is totally invented by the Enlightenment age, and that departs from the scriptural tradition and so forth. I have been arguing that there is a version of rights that is derived from the natural law tradition, but only one version, and that is the American version, which links it back to the English version, and which in turn links rights back to natural law. Remember Burke, light refracted through the glass, right? We live in this world of trying to enact the abstract truths of pure divine justice in this broken here and now, and unless we are hooked by some anchor, however many thousands of years removed, to that notion that that's where these things come from, then it's true. These are fictions just like unicorns. And in fact, the fictionality of them is obvious in the incoherence with which people talk about them, right? So my suggestion is that MacIntyre is correct about almost all rights discourse, and that my answer to him is to emphasize, therefore, the essential uniqueness of the American tradition from which the creator cannot be removed. But if you believe in natural law, you can, I think, plausibly believe in natural rights. If it's naturally the case that all men are created equal, then you can speak meaningfully about it being illegal or wrong inherently to take their life without just cause. So there's MacIntyre as a fruitful, I think, interlocutor, somebody that I think you should totally go away and read. I wanted to make you aware of that because there is a very robust, especially Commonwealth tradition, the Brits, right, and their, ex-colonies and so forth. There's a very robust Commonwealth tradition of denying that this sort of inalienable right piffle is anything at all, and that positive rights exist, but inalienable divine natural rights are nonsense. I think that natural rights are an extension of natural law, but you can only make that argument if you believe that natural law comes from where it truly comes from, which is Aquinas and before him, the Bible, right? So all this long history that I've been arguing is designed to equip you to endorse the American point of view. If that is indeed, if you find my arguments plausible here, you should be an Americanist in the founding sense, right? And that, to me, is part of what it means to be a conservative in the true sense in America, right? Because, of course, America has this weird internal contradiction that, we begin with the revolution, and yet we do have this conservative tradition, not to conserve, as my colleague at Claremont, Bill Vogley, has been talking about, the ancien regime. Like, we're not European conservatives who want monarchy, but we do want to recover the true original sense of our founding documents. One way to do that is to acknowledge that endowed by their creator is a pivotal linchpin of that sentence, and that indeed, in turn, the Declaration is not some sort of frilly other document. But although it is not law, that is to say, it's not the Constitution, nevertheless, it is the whole context within which all the rest of our law should be understood. Because then we do move forward into this kind of, post-British common law tradition where we are doing what Burke is talking about, which is thinking about how we enact this stuff in the here and now and in the day-to-day. And we're going to start getting into more of that a little bit later. But let me just now reaffirm, right, what we've been arguing so far, so I can take us up to where we've gotten, which is that these sorts of things, if you pull away that plank, that load-bearing pillar, we think that we can float in air, but we actually are already devolving into nonsensical beasts, right? And that's what I've been arguing about the UN's declaration, right? That it doesn't make, none of the words in it literally make any sense. Like, and it's so funny once you look at it because you think like, yes, human rights, blah, blah, blah. Like, it's really easy to kind of just get lulled like a kind of song into, we reaffirm this all the time. It's like literally none of these words make sense. They just don't make sense. Like they're literally, there's no subject to the verbs, like they're actual nonsense. And this is why I return now, not only to Canada, right, where I'm going to just reread for you what I read to you last week, that in Canada, having given the state, right, the right to intervene to end a human life, which would not otherwise end, right, the state is now, of course, in the position of weighing the worth of human lives, because here, right, you can make all sorts of discussions about middle ground, edge cases where you're saying, well, maybe, in certain extreme-ish situations, whatever. But here there is no middle ground. Either humanity, human beings, all, without exception, every member of the species is created in the image of God. You, me, everybody listening, everybody not listening, all the libs, everybody that hates us, all people created in the image of God and therefore endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. Or it's the state's job to weigh pluses and minuses, to draw up a balance sheet and evaluate a person as a bottom line. And that's what's happening in Ontario, right? A woman in Ontario was forced into euthanasia because her housing benefits did not allow her to get better housing, which didn't aggravate her crippling allergies. And the state is saying, well, you probably should just kill yourself. Another disabled woman applied to die because she simply can't afford to go on living. Another sought euthanasia because COVID-related debt left her unable to pay for the treatment, which kept her chronic pain bearable. And when I go off on this COVID stuff, by the way, right, I know I can get a little extreme about it, but this is why. It's not because I'm like want you to vote red all the time. Or again, like just like, I think you should vote red in most situations, but that's not what this is about, right? Like, I am talking here about fundamental erosion of the logic behind our very, very hard-won and hard-fought convictions that all men are created equal and born free. And people, go out there with their faces hanging out and they say all men are created equal, they say all men are born free, and then they end up doing stuff like in Canada. And that's because they have completely forgotten the logic behind the claim that all men are created equal and born free. And I'm going to, if you don't believe me, if you think that this Canada thing is just one sensationalist argument, let me point out to you that here's an article from the Journal of Medical Ethics in 2013 discussing an argument that goes back at least to 1972. It's by a philosopher named Peter Singer, and he's surveying this debate. Michael Tooley initiated the discussion of infanticide in contemporary applied ethics in his article Abortion and Infanticide, published in Philosophy and Public Affairs in 1972. I defended infanticide for severely disabled newborn infants in Practical Ethics, first published in 1979, and again with Helga Kues in 1985 in Should the Baby Live? Alberto Giublini and Francesca Minerva have revisited this topic in their article, provocatively titled After Birth Abortion, Why Should the Baby Live? Their article adds some thoughts about the justifiability of infanticide in cases in which the infant is not severely disabled, including a discussion of whether it could be justifiable to kill the newborn infant, even when there is a couple who are keen to adopt such a child, something that Helga Kues and I rejected. We should be open to discussing these views, whether or not we end up agreeing with Giublini and Minerva. This stuff is real. I'm not making it up. I'm not caricaturing my enemies. There are people out there making very measured, cogent, well, supposedly cogent, and certainly, highly respectable arguments in highly respectable journals, respectable in the sense of the world, not, I believe, in reality, right? But highly, sophisticated arguments that you should be able to kill an unwanted baby, a born baby, nothing to do with in or out of the womb, a baby that has been born, just, even if somebody wants to adopt it, even if it's not disabled, right? That stuff is real. And if you have been listening to me for the past 2 weeks, you should not be surprised, because we think, well, that's horrifying. But why is it horrifying? Because we are horrified at it because we have been taught to believe that all men are created equal. Why were we taught to believe that? Because somewhere many thousands of years ago, somebody said that mankind is made in God's image. And unless we continue to believe that truth, there's nothing to stop us from becoming the Spartans. We already effectively are. There's nothing to stop us from killing the weak and the infirm like they did in China under the one-child policy. There's nothing to stop us from that. We are not inherently better or smarter than the Greeks or the Romans, right? We're not pure. We're not progressive. We're not advanced. We're just us. And our options are endowed by their creator, created in the image of God. God desires the life of every person to be that he has created. Is that, or it's a howling wasteland, and there's no guarantees out that door. Nobody can tell you that you're going to live in a free, beautiful society of justice and peace and harmony once you walk out that door. This is the island. This is where we stand. We have created this tiny little spot of light in the horrors of the fallen world. It comes to us from thousands of years of tradition, thought, wisdom, and revelation, and we ought not to step off this island, because, my friend, it's not pretty out there. I'm going to keep talking about this. I find this subject so fascinating, and I think it helps us to understand and to live cogently and meaningfully in the present world, because none of this is about trying to scold people or trying to, impede their freedoms. It's trying to recover their freedoms and protect them from a state that wants to treat them like a bottom line and a balance sheet. All right, calling all small business owners, I am looking out for you guys. I do not want you to get crushed under some ridiculous HR compliance issue. That is why Bambee is the place to go. It's BAMBEE, Bambee. They will automate your core policies, workplace training, and employer feedback, and they'll set you up with a dedicated HR manager to help you navigate the more complex parts of HR and guide you to compliance. They are available by phone, email, or real-time chat. I am not a small business owner. However, I work for a business, and our HR manager is incredible. She's so good at her job. She's constantly sending me form after form and being like, sign here, whatever. I'm sure I've signed my life away at this point, but this stuff is so complicated. Not everybody has the resources to hire an in-house HR manager. It can cost up to $80,000 a year. With Bambee, your dedicated HR manager starts at just $99 a month. No hidden fees. Cancel anytime. It's really a sweet deal. You go to Bambee.com/heretics for your free HR audit. BAMBEE.com/heretics. Got to get that link to get the free audit. Bambee.com/heretics. Mailbag questions come to me on Locals, youngheretics.com/locals, where VIPs get extra stuff, and good extra stuff, I have to say. I am writing a commentary on Romans that only VIPs can read, Paul's letter to the Romans. You get to ask me mailbag questions. I write other exclusive essays, and you get episodes a week in advance with no ads. It's really cool, and it's a great platform that I trust and love, built by my buddy Dave Rubin. The whole point is to escape tech censorship, and the community has really become one of my favorite parts of my whole career. So here's Alistair. He says, I've recently read Thomas Paine's Rights of Man. and also Burke's reflection on the revolution in France. Paine seems very optimistic, but also smug-ish about the French Revolution, and obviously criticizes Burke at regular intervals along the way. But having read the two books back to back, I find it hard not to agree with Burke and think Paine is being misguided in his optimism. I guess my question is, in your opinion, does Paine have a good argument regarding the oncoming revolution in France, and does he make any valid points? So now that we've had these 2 weeks of conversation, I think we're very equipped to talk about this question. Tom Paine, big figure, of course, in the American Revolution, somebody that people are often apt to cite as part of it. 1791 writes the response to Burke on the French Revolution, basically like pro-Frenchies, where Burke has decried them. Paine begins by saying, well, it must be said, a bit rude, don't you think, unprovoked, to talk about how bad another country's revolution is. But the more substantive debate and disagreement between them has to do with exactly the questions that we have been discussing. First of all, it must be said and confessed that Paine is less than half the intellect Burke is. And that's just, it vitiates the conversation. It mars the conversation because rather than a kind of sensible exchange between two great thinkers, what we have is one great thinker and one sort of pamphleteer. I'm not a big fan of Tom Paine. So you predict my argument that I don't really think he makes cogent objections to Burke, but I do want to read a sentence from Paine, a couple sentences from Paine, that will say why in a revealing way to add to the conversation we've been having. Paine writes, "Man has no property in man, neither has any generation a property in the generations which are to follow. That which a whole nation chooses to do, it has a right to do." And he's responding here to Burke's objection to the idea that the French have the right to frame a government for themselves. This has been claimed by certain pro-French pastors in England. Burke objected to this notion because he didn't think that you have the right to just up and restart a new government any day of the week, that you just decided to do it. And Paine is an extremist about about the consent of the governed, essentially. And you can see why he is part of this American spirit that we can, rise up and throw off these shackles. Also very Rousseauian to think, well, you get your liberty back. Your liberty belongs to you. You gave it over and you can take it away. The problem is that this is actually not really how social contracts work. It's not. Opponents of social contract theory will often point out that, you never consented to the American Constitution. I mean, you do. Socrates might say you do by continuing to live here. You can go somewhere else, but you didn't sign up. Yes, I agree. The American government. And many people live in America who are bound by her laws, but don't like the Constitution, as we have seen, right? So the validity of the social contract can't be founded simply on each person positively choosing to take on the government when they come to maturity, right? And the reason for this is that Paine is very wrong. He's right that man has no property in man. That's a central principle to the abolition of slavery, right? Man cannot own another man. Neither has any generation a property in the generations that are to follow. He's very wrong about that. Not because we somehow own our children, but that he's misconstruing the sense that we have an inevitable effect on relationship with and responsibilities toward the generations before us and after us. And this is why Burke says that society is a contract between ourselves, the dead, and the unborn. And this is the proper understanding, in my view, of social contract theory, that by writing the Constitution, the founders made a deal with us, with you and me. And we, just as we don't choose to be born, we do not choose, therefore, to enter into that contract, but we also have a responsibility, right, to preserve that contract for the future. This is why C.S. Lewis in The Abolition of Man insists that all decisions we make about science today will not just be decisions for us, but power that we exert over the future generations, right? How will they grow up? How will they be shaped? How will they learn to think about themselves and their souls? This is the crucial question before us today. And unless we understand that we are in this trans-temporal contract and that we do, in fact, have unbreakable links between ourselves and future and past generations, then we will go terribly astray and we will go into chaos like the French Revolution did. That's why it was chaos, is because they didn't have this sense that, well, there's only one reason to break the ties, and that is, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary because of the usurpations. You have to have the contract broken in the sense of actual usurpation of your natural rights, systematically and entirely. And that's what they thought George III had done, and that's why they rebelled, as opposed to this idea that, well, you can just do it anytime. If we all agree, if everybody today got together and voted to to upend the Constitution? Would we have a natural right to do so? Paine says yes, right? That which a whole nation chooses to do, it has a right to do. I say no, and Burke says no. Hope that answers your question. We'll talk more about it on Locals. Thanks for asking, and thanks everyone for listening. Again, let me stress that this is really Claremont territory. You would be well advised to go over to the Claremont Review of Books, The American Mind, read more, read people who disagree with me there, read people who agree with me, and check out our websites and donate at claremont.org/donate to help our work. Really, really appreciate it, and I think you'll love it over there. That's it from me. I will see you next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.